What's up, everybody? Welcome to the channel. In this video, I'm going to be showing you guys how to lock down your API routes with JSON Web Tokens. Let's get into it. All right, so to get started, we're going to go ahead and create a folder that we'll be working out of. You can put this folder wherever you like. And I'm going to put mine in my dev folder. Title it whatever you want. And just a reminder, the first portion of this video will be cleaning up the generated project, and then we'll get into how to actually utilize the JSON Web Tokens. So let's open up a new terminal, and we'll be running an npx script. This script will generate the Express project for us, but instead of a regular Express project, this Express project will use TypeScript. So npx express generator TypeScript, and then between double quotes you'll put the name of the project. Once you're done typing that out, press enter, and this will run the script and generate the project scaffolding for us. This takes away a lot of the tedious work of setting up the folder structure and setting up the project structure, and the different things that you need to make the project run and make the server run, but aren't necessarily the funnest things to do. Okay, so we have our project generated on the left in the JWT folder. We have everything you'd expect to see in a Express server project. The source directory, which we'll be working out of. And now let's start cleaning up some of this stuff that we don't need. So you can get rid of that DAOs folder. We'll change this user entity. So we don't need the class. You can delete that. And then we'll modify this user interface. Let's change it to user. Take out the fields we don't need, and then we'll add a username field. That'll be the only field that we'll be working with in this tutorial. Now we're going to go into our routes folder, and then our users.ts file. We'll delete that user DAO import. We'll delete the rest of these routes that we don't need. And delete the user DAO variable. Delete the user variable. And again, we're just doing all this to strip the project down to just the things we need, so I can focus on the concept. We won't need this views folder. You can delete that. Go in this shared folder, this constants.ts. We won't need this anymore. You can delete that. Clean that up. Clean up that import. Now after that, let's navigate down to the server.ts file. Now all the way at the bottom of this file, we have two more things that we need to get rid of. So that views, anything having to do with views, we'll comment that out, and then we'll comment out this app.get, because that's serving the index.html file, and we don't have a use for that anymore. Okay, so we'll close out all the other files we don't need, and back in the user.ts file, we're going to do something called interface declaration merging. So what we're doing here, we're telling the TypeScript compiler that any requests that come through, you can expect to find a user field on that request. Again, this is called interface declaration merging. So we're declaring an interface with the same name as one that already exists, and we're importing it here, import request from Express, and the compiler will see that it has the same name. So as long as there aren't any conflicts that would break functionality, it'll take both of these interfaces and then merge them into one. So now whenever we work with this request type, we can check for a user field on it. And that's what I'm putting right here in the comments to let the compiler know that it can expect to find a user field in requests. Also, if you notice, there is a question mark after the user. That's making the user field optional, because in real world scenarios, every request may not have the user field, and we don't want anything to break if it doesn't. Now let's get back to the terminal and we'll install the first piece we need. So npm I Json Web Token. This will pull down all of the dependencies that we'll need to work with JSON Web Tokens, and it'll make it easier to work with for us. Delete that one. We were in the wrong directory, so we'll need to delete this package lock too. So let's cd into our project directory and now run that same command. So before, we didn't have our node modules installed to the right directory and we wouldn't have had access to them. So now that we're in our actual project directory, we can go ahead and install it again. So go back in the share, open the functions.ts folder. We'll get rid of all the generated code that came with it. And delete everything in here. Delete the logger too. And now we'll import the JWT that we just imported through the npm script. So const JWT equals require, and then pass in JSON Web Token. And we also want to import our user type that we just modified a bit earlier. Okay, we've imported those two things. Let's also import the request and response and next function from Express, because we'll be working with those types too. Having troubles typing. So now we've imported all the baseline things we need, so let's go ahead and get started. The first thing we'll do is we'll create the class that will handle anything that has to do with JSON Web Tokens. We have our main class, and now we'll have our private variable. Name it access token. So this variable will hold the access token that we generate for the user. We have our constructor function. So we'll set the access token variable to an empty string for now. This will be called every time the class is instantiated. And now let's create the create token function. This function will take a user as in the parameter. We need the user because the user will be a part of the payload in the actual JSON Web Token. So this will help us to validate who's using the token. The return type of this function is a string, so that's what I'm doing there. And we're going to set this access token to a function which comes from the JWT dependency that we just downloaded. So it'll be JWT.sign. We'll pass in our user. And then we'll have to also pass in our secret key. The secret key is kind of the backbone to the access token generation. And we haven't created it yet, but I'll show you guys where to put it. And we'll have this access token expire in 10 minutes. And then after the access token is created, we'll return it back to whoever called this function. on that process.env, which stands for environment.secret key. So we're going to go in our pre-start folder and then the environment folder, env, and then you'll click on development.env, and this is where you define whatever variables you want. We use secret key, and then we'll make our secret key. In real life, you will want to use a much more complex secret key than this, because this is used to generate the JSON Web Token, but for testing purposes, I'll use the basic one. Next, we'll create a function to authenticate those tokens that we dish out. So we'll name it Authenticate Token. We'll pass in a request parameter of type request. And actually, let's change that user to username. It'll be of type string. And we'll pass in that username to the sign function. All right, back to Authenticate Token. We'll have our response of type response, and we'll have our next parameter of type next function. This function won't return anything, so put void right there. The first thing we want to do, we want to grab the authorization header from the request. It'll be a string. The auth header may or may not be there, so its type will be string or undefined. That's why we did it like that. So depending on if the auth header is present or not, we have two different routes that we can take. So if auth header is there, we want to create a variable named user token, and we need to pull that token out of that header. You'll see why we have to do it like this a bit later, but we want to split it after a space, and then after that space we want the first element. That's where our token will be. Now that we have the token, we want to go back into our JWT variable, and then we want to call the verify function. So we'll pass in that token to be verified, and then we'll pass in our secret key, and then we'll have an anonymous function here. This function is serving as our callback. Now, once again, we have two things that can happen. Either an error could be returned, or we could find the user in that token that we just verified. So our first scenario, if the token is invalid, we'll just pass on the message to return to the client. In response, now status, we'll send back a 403 status to the client, and then along with that status, we'll pass in a message in JSON format telling them why. And on the flip side, if no errors return, meaning that we found a user in that access token that we just verified, we'll set the request user field equal to the user that we just pulled from that access token. And now that we have our user, we'll call the next function. This whole authenticate token function is just middleware, so I'll show you what that is later. Now let's handle the case if no auth header is present. We'll create a message again, but this time we'll tell them that there was no access token present in your request. So now we have our class all finished up. Let's go ahead and export an instance of it. So we'll do export let token handler equal new token handler. So we created our object. We're using a singleton pattern. And now that token handler instance is available to be used elsewhere. So let's go back to the users.ts file, and we're going to import that token handler that we just made. Okay, we have our import taken care of. Now let's go ahead and create another file, and in this file we'll take care of all our token routes and token processing. So go into your routes folder, click new file, and let's name this one tokens. With a capital T. So tokens.ts. And let's copy a few things over that we'll need to work with. So let's copy that all of those first 3 lines from the users.ts file, because we'll need all of that. Let's copy the router over and these different requests. What else do we want to strip out? And let's export the router so that we can use it in our index file later. Go ahead and delete that users file. We don't need it anymore. Change that over to tokens. Change this to tokens. This will be the route that our token handler will be accessible under, so we'll change that to token handler. Now we can begin to start building the routes out. So let's do a quick test. We'll do a get mapping, and we'll just do it under root. We'll build out our async function, and we'll have our request and response parameters. And for the purpose of this test, let's just return a simple string back to the client. So we'll use our send method, and we'll send back it works. So when we navigate to our root route under token handler, we should receive it works back. So we'll start our server. Open up a web browser of your choice, localhost 3000, and then we want to type in token-handler API, then token-handler, excuse me. And we know it works, so now we can begin to build out the other routes that we'll need. Okay, for our first official route, we're going to do a post mapping. And let's call this one, let's shut off the server. That stuff gets irritating seeing it refresh, at least for me. So we'll call this one issue-token. We'll use this route to provide the client with the token that they'll need to access our routes. So we'll copy these two parameters over, the request and the response. And now for this one, we'll be utilizing the functions that we made a little bit earlier in our token handler class. So for now, we'll pull out the username from the request body. And now we'll create an access token variable, and we'll set that equal to the token handler's create token function. And to get that function to work, we need to pass in the username that we got from the request. Now that we have that, we'll return the status if it succeeded, and we'll also return the access token. Okay, status. And in the JSON, we'll put our access token. All right, now let's test this endpoint out. So we'll run our start script again. Go back into Google Chrome. We'll go to Postman. All right, pull up our collection. Make sure our Postman agent is running. You'll know it's running when you see that little icon in the top. It'll say connected once you click on it. And that send button will be clickable. So let's copy our route. Change that to a post request. And now let's tack on our issue-token route. And remember, we need that username in the body to be able to generate our access token. Change that to JSON. Remember, we're looking for a username parameter in the body. So we type in username, and then whatever username you want to put. I'll put my own for this one. Press send, and now we have our access token. Now we can break down these different pieces of the actual token. So this first portion of the token is the header that contains the type of token and the type of algorithm used. This second part of it is called the payload. That's where our username is actually encoded into. And then that last part is the signature. So now we can work on our other piece. Go ahead and shut down the server. And this time we'll be creating a route to check our token. So this will be a get mapping. We'll call it check-token. We're going to do all the same setup, but this time we're going to pass in a middleware function. So that authenticate token function that we made. So every request that comes to this path will be passed through that middleware function first to check if the token is valid or not. And then, assuming it does pass through our middleware function, it'll come to our actual paths function. Let me paste that in there. Now remember that authenticate token function, it's doing exactly what its name's saying. It's checking to see if that token is valid or not. Send them an OK message. an OK status, excuse me, and then we'll send them some message in the JSON. Made it through our defense, which is top notch. Let's start our server back up. Now let's change that to check token. And we're gonna need to save that just for future reference. We're gonna create a new request. Change that to check. And we'll need that JWT that we generated last time. And we're gonna put it here in our authorization header. So remember, we separated the token string by the space. This is why. And you want to make sure the type is a bearer token. And you see what happens if you try to access the route without the token. Back in our function, there wasn't an access token present, so they got that message. Now let's try to use a bad one. Invalid token attempted. So let's grab our token that we generated earlier, copy it, paste it in here, and we made it through. So that concludes this video. I just wanted to do something quick that shows you guys how to create a basic server using JWTs. So stay tuned and subscribe. Thanks.